Okay, so I'm the guilty party who decided that we should have a bit of a break from technical discussions because sometimes at these conferences the talks get a little long and a little dry, and I thought that having a discussion on more esoteric considerations might be of value to everyone who is listening in, and so I kind of put a cheeky headline on our title here. You know, can we? Do data matter? Do analysis matter? Can they help us build homes faster? So, in our program, we collect a lot of data, a lot of information, and we try to make use of it in promoting people to make better decisions and for Ontario. So, really, what drove? I'll go to the next slide, Rob, if you could. So what drove my thinking on this? It just in the last few years, it seems like there's lots of practitioners who are not quite as energized as maybe they should be. And you know, when we discuss with some of the technical folks at the different agencies, there's a lot of focus on development review and reading reports, and they're being driven to produce analysis and feedback really quickly. You talk to consultants and they're, you know, lamenting about having to be chargeable. There's a focus on, you know, from consulting companies that are becoming more publicly traded, a focus on increasing the bottom line and so on. And so, you know, that's what driven some of my thinking. And there's lots of changes happening. So on top of the pandemic and technology, there's a lot of legislative changes that are happening in Ontario, and so that's swirling around my head and a lot of the people I chat to. And then in the abstract that I wrote, I thought, well, maybe are there any, you know, future directions that might provide a spark and engage people? And I threw out, you know, geothermal and maybe planning for the subsurface as two maybe more interesting things that we could chase into the future. So in the discussions at the panel, so the panelists, I'll let them introduce themselves as we go through it, but we've had a couple of conversations, you know, to get ready for our discussion today. And two of the most recurring themes that came up were this issue of change in communication. And so before we go to our expert panelists, the next slide, please, Rob. I thought we'd go to, you know, another expert in some of these things, and that's Dilbert, of course. And so I'll give you, you know, a few seconds while our first panelist gets ready to talk to digest a little bit of humor. So you know, we got to change it up from all the dry hydrogeology talk. Okay, so with those introductory, one final thing I'll leave you with is that we've heard on a couple of talks this morning from, you know, Patty's talk about, you know, really digging in the data and finding excitement there in changing the whole Bedrock Valley or potentially changing the Bedrock Valley. Sonia had a, you know, exciting, making hydrographs more exciting. Beatrice was talking about making water, you know, to kids more exciting. So really there's an element that we want to do in this panel discussion is try to ignite a spark and you know, if you ask yourself, would you recommend to people coming out of university or going into university, would they become a hydrogeologist or an earth scientist? And I think more and more the answer to that amongst our colleagues is maybe a no, and I've always thought it should be a yes, and I think it's more important as we go forward. So anyway, those are some of the ideas that we've thrown around in our discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric to lead us off. Eric the Young. We have two Erics here, so we'll go Eric the Young and Eric the Old. And one of the other things I will mention when we go to external questions, if you have a question that's directed for a specific panel member, maybe just throw their initials on your Slido question. And if it's general, maybe just put a G. So at the beginning, before your question, just if you want it focused for someone. Okay, so now I'll be quiet and I'll pass it on to Eric. Next slide, please. And just say next slide when you want Rob to move your slides.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric DeYoung, or Eric Chevrier, as my family likes to call me. I work at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority as a hydrogeologist. I just wanted to start off by thanking Steve Holysh and the other panel members for including me and giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'd also like to thank my fellow hydrogees of the TRCA for their support in my preparation for this panel. Next slide, please. So why am I here? To be honest, I was a little surprised when Steve sent me an email asking me to be a panelist for this event. I didn't feel that at this point in my early career that I would really have much to contribute to a panel focusing on the current state and direction of the industry. But in speaking with Steve and the other panel members, I think the goal was to diversify the panel a bit and bring in some fresh perspectives. And I think an early career perspective is one that can get overlooked in the grand scheme. So today I'm going to touch on a few areas where I think we as a community can look to improve, and also a few bright spots that I've noticed throughout my university and early career experience. And then I'm also going to, offer some thoughts on ways we can engage with the younger generation of geoscientists and get them excited to step into the professional world. Next slide, please. So I'll just briefly go over my background. I graduated from the Department of Geological Science at Queen's in 2018. Following that, I did a brief summer stint with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks in their Eastern Region Water Resource Unit, primarily focusing on landfill monitoring report review and evaluating existing or potential off-site groundwater impacts. After my time with the MECP, I ventured into the consulting world where I spent 4 years with Arcadis Canada, again, primarily focused on contaminated site evaluation and remediation. And as of September of 22, I took on a hydrogeologist role with the TRCA, which is how I find myself speaking to you today. Next slide. So we all had to sit in the university classrooms, right? And I'm going to touch on a bit of my university experience and then kind of walk through that. But like I said, we all had to sit in those classrooms and theory. We all had to sit there and get that drilled into our heads. And that's definitely not a bad thing. It's the baseline of our science. It has to be taught. But I always found there was a disconnect between what's being taught and how this knowledge actually translates into a career and what that career is actually going to look like. I did have one professor who at the end of his slide deck every lecture would put in what he called a who cares or a so what slide, right? And basically he would go over the relevance of this one particular lecture to potential career paths and something as simple as one slide. I mean, it sounds silly, but I always thought it was such a great idea to bridge that gap between classroom and the professional world. Another area where I think the university experience can be improved is communicating what opportunities are available post-grad. And a great way of doing that is having young alumni come in and talk about their careers and be available for current students. And it doesn't have to be much, right? Like we could video call somebody in for a quick 15-minute discussion and some questions and some answers. And I think something as simple as that can generate major interest and get people more excited about geoscience careers and in particular hydrogeology. But any potential solution we're going to come up with, it's going to have to be an integrated approach, right? This can't be only on the professors or alumni or industry. It's going to have to take everyone, and we as a community need to generate interest in what we do. And I think once we start to generate that interest, we can create opportunity for the next generation. Next slide, please. One particular bright spot that I've had the opportunity to be a part of is the Queen's Geo Alumni Resource Network, or the Garnet program. I think it's an absolutely fantastic resource for soon-to-be grads and a program that I think every geoscience department should look to have. The goal of the program being to connect upper-year undergraduate students with a working professional in that student's field of interest to facilitate a learning environment for career development. I've been involved in the program for the last few years, and it's quite simple. Like I said, it requires very little time commitment. I personally try and meet with my mentees every other month, depending on schedule, and our meetings last about 20 to 30 minutes. So I typically use that time to answer any questions they might have about job applications or roles, or just to talk about an interesting project I happen to be working on. So again, very brief, very informal, very quick. But something as simple as this program, again, is an incredible way to generate interest in hydrogeology and also act as a platform where us working professionals can spread the word on the importance of the work we're doing and why that work matters. Next slide, please. So another bright spot that I was first exposed to when I started at the TRCA is the Oak Ridges Moraine Groundwater Program's website, it's just such a fantastic tool for amalgamizing, synthesizing, and presenting groundwater data from this region of Ontario. Rick and Steve's team are doing incredible work here, and I highly recommend people check it out if they haven't already. I use this site on almost a daily basis, and it provides extremely valuable information for the work we do at the TRCA. The website is highly user-friendly. I am by no means a computer expert, but I find it extremely easy to use and intuitive while also providing extremely accurate information. Steve has mentioned to me previously, and there are currently the potential for partnerships with universities and the groundwater program. And I think bringing these tools into the classroom can not only generate interest in hydrogeologic careers, but also prepare students for the professional world by working with real data, using real tools that people are using in the industry. Next slide, please. So I just threw up a couple snapshots here of what the website can do with generating groundwater contours and extract sections and all that good stuff. But this really barely scratches the surface of its full capabilities. A few slides back, I was mentioning that a lot of the classroom material is theory-based, and that can be fairly dry. But I think incorporating tools like this can only help the learning experience by providing visual reference into some of the groundwater issues we face in Southern Ontario. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk here a bit about some of my own early professional experiences and things I've noticed, but then also touch on some of the experiences of other younger geoscience professionals that I've spoken with and highlight some of the areas that I think we can look to improve on as a community. One thing that I always found was so demoralizing when you first start applying for jobs is in that job description, it says entry level, right? And when you're first coming out of your school, you're like, great, that's me. And then that next little bullet point there would say requires 3 years of experience. And it's just like, okay, maybe that's not me. And the frustration with these postings is a sentiment that's been shared by multiple mentees that I've had in the Garnet program. It's that classic loop. I can't get a job without experience, and I can't get experience without having a job. So what am I supposed to do here? My advice to those mentees is apply anyways, but I do know that a lot of people won't apply to these jobs, and companies might be missing out on great candidates because of that little experience requirement. Quiet quitting, which is basically defined as doing the bare minimum of the job, putting in no more time, effort, or enthusiasm than is absolutely required. There's a lot of different opinions on this and what's causing it, but from the people I've spoken with, it seems to me that quiet quitting stems from lack of engagement, and I feel that lack of engagement stems from the two reasons which are highlighted here in my next 2 points. I think Steve kind of alluded to this, but to me there seems to be more of an emphasis these days on corporate over career goals. How many billable hours do I have? How many reports can I write? How many files can I review? And I understand at the end of the day, most of us work for a business, and that business needs to make money. So I'm not trying to downplay the importance of corporate goals, but I think if engagement is our issue, then we need to put more of an emphasis on learning development throughout the life of an individual's career. And that brings me to my last point here, which is it becomes extremely difficult to remain engaged in your work when you don't see where that work is going to take you, or you don't feel that there's an opportunity for advancement or continued learning. That feeling of being pigeonholed or stuck in the mud doing the exact same work day after day for years is a pretty common feeling that I've heard from multiple early career professionals. Next slide, please. So what can we do about this stuff, right? Like, what are we going to do about these issues? Quiet quitting, as I mentioned before, I think a shift to a more career-based goal setting can give people the opportunity and corporate backing to seek professional learning opportunities, which at the end of the day, it's only going to provide value to the business, and it can also elevate that engagement by exposing people to different opportunities at work. I think the best way to provide learning opportunities is through informal mentorships. And this is something that I have a bit of experience with. Since I joined the TRCA, my colleague Christina Anderson and I have formed an informal mentorship-like relationship, which happened completely organically through the onboarding process. And it's facilitated a tremendous amount of career growth and learning for myself, which I'm extremely appreciative of. And that's been a fantastic mentee-mentor relationship for me. as I mentioned in the last slide, limited opportunity and lack of career direction are very common sentiments in early professionals. And I think the best way to avoid this is to promote new tasks and responsibilities to avoid that feeling of being stuck in the mud with your career. And again, like I was mentioning before, the approach has to be twofold, right? It has to be on the employee to seek out new opportunities. But then we also need the cooperation of senior leadership and management to facilitate those opportunities to promote that career growth. And through that growth, I think we can foster engagement. Next slide, please. So I actually believe geocommunication is the most important topic I'm going to touch on today. In the information and technology age, everything is digital, everything is online. And if we want to communicate the importance of our role to the public and to future generations of hydrogeologists, we have to be communicating on the platforms people are using. 4.62 billion social media users worldwide. That represents 58% of the world's population, and that number is only going to grow over time. So I think the reality of the situation is people use social media to communicate and get their news these days. And hey, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think is up for debate, but it is the reality of the world we live in. So if we want our voices to be heard, we need to be on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, etc. These social media platforms. We've got to be active on them, and we have to be communicating to people what it is we're doing and why it matters. We can't be sitting in our own echo chambers agreeing about the problems, right? We've got to get our voices out there in order to be heard, and I think this is one of the best options we have for doing that. Next slide, please. So I just threw up this status chart here. I thought it was pretty interesting. And again, just to reiterate what I was saying before, as we move into the younger generations here, moving from right to left, you can kind of see that as we get into the younger people, we see the increase in daily social media use go up. And then, vice versa, moving the opposite way, we start to see that never use social media start to go up. But again, I think this just kind of highlights the point I was trying to make. So social media, people are on it, we've got to be on it, and we've got to be active. Next slide, please. So Outlook. A few weeks back, my colleagues and I had the chance to listen to Dr. John Cherry give his presentation on the global water crisis. The presentations gave us an overview into the global impacts of climate change and groundwater resource mismanagement. And to be frank, the global outlook was pretty grim. But one thing that Dr. Cherry touched on that I really found interesting was that although the global groundwater outlook isn't great, right? Canada and specifically Ontario is positioned really well simply because we have an abundance of water resources here already. So when I think about the future of hydrogeology, I think there's an important opportunity for us and the next generations to play a critical role in the way the province and the country manage their water resources. And I think this is the message that we really need to be reiterating and getting out there. And what do those opportunities look like for the next generation? I'm not entirely sure, but I think it looks like a lot of the things we're already doing, meaning testing, quantification, mapping, source water protection, all these great things. But I think as we move forward into the future here, these roles are only going to be viewed as far more critical. I just hope the landscape changes a bit so that we can look to be a bit more proactive instead of reactive with regards to some of these groundwater issues. Next slide, please. So the next generation, one thing I've noticed, and I can honestly say I share the sentiment, is that the younger generations care deeply about their work having meaning, and they want to feel like what they're doing is having an impact. I've also had this communicated to me by multiple mentees in the Garnet program. The younger generations have been listening to us. They understand that we need to be sustainable with our resources, and in particular our water resources. And I think the biggest takeaway is that they are eager and excited to be involved in the solutions to these problems. And I think it's our job as members of the community right now to work with the younger generations to impart to them not only the scientific knowledge that we have, but also where there's potential to make an impact and what those opportunities might look like. So, like I mentioned before, we can't be sitting in our own echo chambers and agreeing amongst ourselves if there's issues, right? We need to be louder, and we need to be doing a better job of advocating for ourselves and relaying the importance of the work we're doing. The louder we are, the larger our reach, and ultimately the larger impact we can have. Next slide, please. So that's where I'm going to leave it right now. Again, I just wanted to thank Steve Holysh and the rest of the panel members for including me in the discussion today. I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else's thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for your comments, Eric. And our next panelist is Simon Gautrey. So The next slide, Rob, will go right to Simon's presentation. Over to you, Simon.
All right. Thank you, Steve. I failed to put an introduction slide for myself. Simon Gautrey, hydrogeologist with WSP, which used to be Wood, that used to be AMEC Foster Wheeler, that used to be AMEC. Been working for 27 years. I got started in hydrogeology back in undergrad, just thinking about Eric's story, about his influential professor and his single slide. I had Donald Desaulniers, who was a consultant in working in Montreal. He came in and he taught a hydrogeology course part-time. And the way that he taught it made me really get excited about hydrogeology. And that's how I ended up becoming a hydrogeologist. He told me I needed to go to Waterloo, which I did my master's there with Dave Rudolph and Paul Caro. And I have a bit of sad news about Paul. For those of you guys who don't know, he passed away in early February. Paul was a great quaternary geologist, mapped, I don't know, half, 3/4 of southern Ontario, I think, on his mapping, 150,000 map sheets. After Waterloo, I was lucky enough to get a job at Water with Tim and Tony Lotimer. They in a small water supply company. They were great to work with. They really were into methods to try and collect hydrogeologic data. They had their own downhole geophysics tools, old downhole cameras. They provided a perspective that I didn't think I'd get anywhere else. I did a short stint at the ministry, then a few years at contaminant hydrogeology, went down to California, worked with Murray Einison on some of the big lawsuits, groundwater lawsuits cases that used to happen back then. Came back to Canada, stayed with Geosyntect, worked with their Miché and Tom Krug and those guys over in Guelph, before they pulled me back to Water. Then I started at AMEC and been there for close to 20 years. It's a big company, but my experience with it, I was the only hydrogeologist when I got started, so I got to build the group from the ground up. I've quite enjoyed my career. So that's enough about me. I better talk about what my slides are about. I wanted to talk about, the sort of, talk about judgment and the importance of judgment in groundwater decision, a career, and why does hydrogeological data and analysis matter? So start with, I think, over a long career, with the amount of data that we collect now is enormous. Every transducer can collect a reading every second. We can get, vast amounts of information, great new geophysical tools, better sampling technology, lower detection limits. We have multiple drilling and coring options. And all this data requires more analysis. And along with all this, which is fortunate because computing power is increasing enormously. The computers which we could run 27 years ago, the modeling that we did at the start of my career compared to what can be done now, the number of nodes you can put in, the time it takes to run different scenarios, it's an enormous change. So, yeah, we're getting more data and more analysis. But my question, is this leading to us making better decisions? Next slide, please. So to start with, are we using the tools we have at our disposal? With all these choices we have, what do we pick? What methods do we choose? Obviously, we're limited by budget and schedule. It's a competitive market. You've got to pick the right tools. But beyond the obvious budget and schedule ones, I also sort of think there's some cultural limitations on our use of tools. We work for risk-averse companies, and we work for a regulatory environment that doesn't necessarily, and not to blame the regulators overly, but it doesn't necessarily, everybody likes tried and true methods. So that means we end up doing a lot of the same things over and over again. We do it because it worked last time. And that's what our clients want, and that's what our managers want. They want surety in the outcomes. Innovation does happen in our field. It happens a lot outside of Ontario, I would say. Now that's partly because jurisdictions like California spend billions, not billions, but way more money than we do in Ontario on groundwater management. They've got big issues over there. We do have innovation here. The way that we're building these databases for groundwater management, like the tools, or establishing online tools for places we can all go get information from. I think we're doing very well on multi-stakeholder involvement. We're very good, we spend a lot of time and process of trying to talk to public, working with other specialties. I think these are things that we can, which we could look at as being innovative. But I also think that business-wise and regulatory-wise, we're risk adverse. I'm not sure when it comes to these new tools if we've invested the time as a community to get to know them. I mean, that might be because professional lives are very time constrained. Sometimes people think that the responsibility of learning and teaching is the responsibility of others. And so I'm saying that we have the tools, we may not use them. Is there a disconnect between our work and social outcomes, which I'll talk about a bit on the next slide. I think there is, and I'm going to say this is for a number of reasons, not just because of us as individuals. Groundwater moves slowly, particularly where there's a lot of aquitard's presence. So there's decades between the decisions we make and the outcomes that, or the groundwater problem that we'll develop. That creates that distance in time. Your career might be done before a problem appears. Lowers people's sense of responsibility and ownership. We're also Ontario. There's most of our population centres are down by the Great Lakes. There's vast amounts of water there. And down by the Great Lakes, for the most part, there are a lot of good aquitards, so the contamination doesn't happen that often. I mean, we have our Elmiras, our Smithfields, our Walkerton events, and it'll be interesting to see how this final chloride spill down in Ohio is going to change the EPA's attitude towards groundwater contamination. But for the most part, groundwater projects in Ontario are small, and we rarely look at cumulative effects, at least when we're dealing with, as on the consulting side, where we're looking at it, say, subdivision by subdivision or gas station by gas station. And I'm not sure if we're doing ourselves any favors, because professionally, we're all very nice to one another. We don't go out of our way to call each other out. That means that does great for cooperation, but that is not great for holding people accountable or putting people's feet to the fire. It doesn't help that we're split professionally into engineers and geoscientists, and there's two different rules. We have the same code of ethics, more or less, but there are two different sort of emphases on the engineers versus the geoscientists. We work for a lot of corporations that, we used to work for hydrogeology companies when I started, but now I work for a giant corporation, and the number of hydrogeologists is minuscule compared to the total number of population or employees. It means getting, groundwater to the front of the corporate boardroom is harder than it was before. And we work in regulatory environment. I mean, all regulatory environments are limited by the lack of resources, but ours, like others, lack resources, but also there's the permit process. Regulators get heavily involved in when issuing a permit, but once something's happening, their influence is reduced a lot. All this, I think, adds up to creating a situation where the lot of the groundwater work we do is of low consequence. And if it's of low consequence, I mean low consequence because we're not going to affect people's water supply. The contamination basically doesn't get too far. The sites of the property we're dealing with are relatively small to the size of the issue. And if we're dealing with problems of low consequence, it means a lot of the decisions we make don't necessarily matter too much, or that could be a trap we could fall into. Next slide, please. So if that is the case here in Ontario, at least, does good judgment matter? And I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say for a number of reasons I have here, and I might be there's others too, which I hope other people we can discuss later. But a career is long, 40-year career, really. You could be working at this for 40 years. If you are working on low consequence projects for your entire career, it's mind-numbing. You won't, where is the fun in that? I also think low consequence is a moving target. Societal trends, population growth mean that the existing aquifers that we have are going to be stressed by population growth. Societal trends are changing. The values about groundwater in California are completely different to what they are here in Ontario. But we get a lot of our media, social media from California. And with that come the values from California. So groundwater is not going to stay low consequence forever. technological changes are happening. We're getting new tools to measure what we happening. We can see things happen in the data, and there's going to be pressure on us. We can't pretend that it's not there anymore. We'll be able to see it in data trends. There are economic trends which are also happening, modeling. Though I don't like this trend, it's easy to outsource modeling. It's easy to see the modeling will be shipped offshore. And if it goes to a low-cost environment like India, then the cost of modeling should drop enormously fast. And then the last trend is it's happening in the professional regulatory organizations like the PNGs and the PGOs. For a long time, self-regulation has been acceptable, but the public is taking less. This is becoming less acceptable to the public now. The way the PNGs are being run and the way the PGOs are being run for advanced jurisdictions like BC is there are a lot of non-geoscientists running the boards. It won't be geoscientists making decisions on how geoscience are going to be regulated. It's going to be non-geoscientists working out what is in the best interest for the public. And so that's going to change how we get regulated ourselves. So all of this means you're going to need good judgment, because I think it's going to be more accountable in the future. Next slide, please. So how do we get good judgment if we work in a low consequence environment where decisions don't matter too much? Well, probably all of us know that where we've made mistakes is, and I love some of these quotes here, but my favorite one is the good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment. But basically, you get the experience you need to solve a problem just after you needed it. That's a great quote, and I completely agree. There are points in my career where it's been you lose sleep. You wonder if you made the right call. And fortunately, I've had good people, good mentors to help me out. But I don't advocate for learning through making bad decisions. There are other ways you can do it. Other people make bad decisions and you can learn from them. This is why companies have reviewers and internal review policies and stuff like that. If you work in an organization where they share their stories, that's a great way to learn. Case studies. Although there are hardly any hydrogeology case studies, and even the ones that are out there tend to be good news case studies, they are great places to learn. It's not just we're humans. We don't make mistakes. We don't just make mistakes with the science. We make a lot of its human factors. You can put yourself under some pressure in a relatively safe environment. Present at a conference. Put yourself out there. Put your hand up. Ask some questions. Be prepared to make a fool of yourself. We're a pretty forgiving bunch, but you put yourself under some bit of pressure. That's a good way to intensify your learning. And lastly, if you really want to learn about working in a high consequence environment, work in a high consequence environment. Move to California, move to Mexico or some other place. Work in those environments where water their attitude to water is quite different. Or work on the larger projects. If you're in mining or the large scale infrastructure projects where there are either, watersheds are on the line or millions of dollars are on the line, you're going to be holding up projects. Then you'll feel the pressure. Then you're going to lose some sleep. And so, I think that about wraps it up. I don't think I have any more slides. Do I have another slide? There you go. I'm all done.
Thanks for that, Simon. Really, really good insights there and good food for thought. So we'll go to Eric the Old now, and I'll pass it to you, Eric.
Thanks for that, Steve. You can hear me, I'm hoping.
Yeah, all good.
I didn't realize I was going to get that moniker when I agreed to participate in the program, but given the color of my hair compared to Steve's, then I guess I'll have to accept it. And you can tell the old Eric from the young Eric, because the young Eric's the only one who doesn't have any glasses on. So I guess, in picking up the themes that both Simon and Eric have brought up, I think my theme is really going to be talking about the communication side of things. I also didn't have a slide of my career, although it's a much shorter resume than Simon's. I had 8 years in consulting, and I'm on my 29th year at the region of Waterloo. So next slide, Rob. So I think, you know, a lot of these slides and the points have been made by others in terms of where they see things. From my perspective, being in a municipality for a long time, what I see is like groundwater is really the little siblings of surface water. You put up with it because you have to, but you'd really rather not have to. That's the way I feel that most of society views groundwater. That's partly because it's out of sight, out of mind. It's beneath our feet. The people don't really know. It's not a tangible thing to them. 90% of the drinking water supply for the province comes from surface water by the Great Lakes primarily, but also some of the smaller ones. So again, groundwater is really not on the minds of those people who are drinking water, and they're thinking about surface water impacts. We were late getting into the I guess the municipal role, that there really wasn't much hydrogeology experience in the conservation authorities and the municipalities until the late 90s, or until the middle late 90s. And a lot of our urban core areas were largely developed, and so the processes that continued from that earlier time have some of those have carried forward. The province, certainly in the early days, seemed to be more interested in the water quantity side and perhaps the borehole registry, but wasn't really interested in the water quality side until Waterton. The University of Waterloo, a great leader in their Center for Research in the 1980s, but had a large focus primarily from where the funding was coming from many large U.S. corporations on the contamination side of things. And I'm seeing, you know, an ongoing process to minimize the need for and the scope of different assessments that have to become, whether it be through coding and standardization of processes like the cleanup of contaminated sites, the self-registration for dewatering, or the Aggregate Resources Act and the hydrogeologic assessments. Seemed to be an initial thought that the Clean Water Act was really a once-time through. Once we got the technical work done, that it was just a little tweaking around the edges, and certainly the presentation by Patty Meyer earlier this morning certainly reinforced that increased knowledge can really change the way these areas look. And then from a stormwater management perspective, groundwater is really is a secondary issue. You know, it's the stormwater is about handling all the flow that happens during a rain event, and very little consideration is given to, you know, what either may happen with the interaction between groundwater and surface water, or the contribution that groundwater has on a surface water feature such as the stormwater pond. Next slide, Rob. So when you look at the roles of what the hydrogeology sector provides to a municipality, I think there is certainly beyond these four bullets that I have here, but that a lot of it is focused on the geotechnical and the dewatering side for constructability. How much water do I have to remove? How deep do I have to go? What are the soil conditions? And is there enough structural support for my building? Stormwater retention is all about keeping the water from entering the rivers quickly. So reducing the flooding opportunity, and then the due diligence associated with contamination, whether that would be property itself, underneath a road, crossing a road. It's really a focus on just making sure that the property you're investigating at that time is properly assessed, and there's little risk to the property owner. If just a click on there, maybe it's the next slide, Rob. If we look at it from the perspective of a municipality that relies on groundwater for drinking water supply, so the kind of the series of communities that are on the edge of the Great Lakes, on the edge of the GTA area, so the Guelph, the community that Patty was talking about, Georgetown, Milton, Regional Waterloo, Woodstock, we all have a groundwater resource, and so our focus tends to be a little bit more regimented and looking at slightly different things as it relates to those same four main production or same more factors that hydrogeologists typically comment on. So if you think about geotechnical, all of that work and all of the shallow subsurface construction is a transport pathway that might bring contamination down to the deeper supply well. Any amount of dewatering in an area for a small or a large construction project for a road, there's no actual notification to local municipalities that the dewatering is going to occur. So you could get supply interference. Stormwater, while it's important to reduce flooding, if you're just infiltrating it, then you're infiltrating many of the contaminants that are washing off the roads and the paved surfaces, such as salt. So there's a quality and a quantity impact. And from a contamination perspective, obviously, from a drinking water source, you're concerned about whether or not that drinking water source can be contaminated by that adjacent activity. And the way that the risk assessment process works for those for a site-specific risk assessment is the impacts to drinking water sources, while considered to some extent, may or may not be entirely assessed depending on the nature of where you're getting your drinking water from. And at the end of the day, it's either unclear or it's uncertain how you're supposed to move forward if you do have offsite impacts that could have a potential impact on the drinking water source. Next slide, Rob. In addition to all of these areas, I think there's, I've always been very excited about working at the Region of Waterloo, largely because of the wide variety of different projects that we get to be involved with, and obviously because of our size, we have a lot of opportunity to do things a bit more than some of the smaller municipalities might do. The Clean Water Act, we have 120 water supply wells focused in 40 different well protection areas. So we take a lot of pride in trying to get hydrogeologic investigations at each one of those sites. Supply well rehabilitation and replacement is a huge challenge for us. These wells pump a lot of water all the time, and so trying to take a certain number of them offline to do regular well rehabilitation and maintenance is challenging. Permit to take water compliance, not too bad in terms of how challenging that is, but we've got a lot of permits, we've got a lot of water level monitoring, and we've got a lot of reporting to the province every year. In fact, we can't even use their online system. We have to just give them a spreadsheet because their system crashes when we try to use it. The quality analysis, you could see some of the tools that we have on one of those graphs on the right. That's the chloride levels in one of our drinking water supply wells. I didn't mark the 250 milligram per liter chloride level, but basically all of those red, yellow, and orange lines are way above those. So being able to undertake that quality analysis is important for the supply that we're producing. Future supply assessments, we're supposed to grow by 300,000 people. That's a 50% increase over our current population. It's going to mean about another 200 liters a second of water, and given the amount of water we already take, that's going to be a challenge. Data management, we had a whole day through this conference on Tuesday talking about data management, so there's a lot of that. Operational support. Our operations people tend to like to operate the wells at a sweet spot. But if you ever ask them, or if a well has to be shut down for something and they have to pump more water out of a well, they don't know how to do that. So you actually have to provide your hydrogeologic knowledge to them so that they can make informed decisions. And obviously informed decisions are an integral part of the policy development approach. And if you have strong technical skills, then you might have the luxury of actually being able to try to write some policy work to help protect your drinking water supply. Next slide, Rob. So if we think about where these responsibilities are, or what what's in store for groundwater-based communities and municipalities in general, my first bullet there is that I think as we get into more standardization, that implies more due diligence on behalf of us as the professionals. Clients won't necessarily know what they're missing or what they should need. So there's a lot of information that you needed to be able to communicate up to those clients and project managers at who's ever funding you to say, we do need to be able to do this and understand and take a thorough assessment. If not, you could have problems, and it's better to avoid it, so do it now. Growth sustainability, as I think Eric, your slides mentioned, the younger generation is very much interested in sustainability. Can we sustain the growth that's planned for the 1.5 million houses that we need to build? That will be a considerable change. Certainly, again, in consideration for the climate change. So while we don't have the same degree of droughts that we have in California, what we do suspect is that with increasing droughts, and this was the example from California, is that people taking surface water supplies then start to tackle developing groundwater wells in order to be able to do their agricultural and livestock feeding needs. So we could expect to see more with increasing drought, more agricultural taking, and which is going to impact the municipal ability to take water. Storm intensity, obviously we're going to get more of those storms. Today was a good example. Last night was a good example. The stormwater quality and quantity balance. I'm sure nobody was complaining today about the amount of salt on the roads because that's the only thing that allowed some of you to get to Waterloo. But that has an impact cumulatively by all these different storms. And again, warmer winters, more freezing rain, we're into the same thing. We had a couple of presentations earlier in relation to awareness, and I think as I started my presentation, that was really where my theme was headed towards, and that we had a couple presentations on communication and awareness by earlier just before lunch, and that is the same emphasis that I want to take. So moving to my last slide. I'm going to borrow from the Stockholm International Water Institute, and last year's World Water Day for them was making the invisible visible. So there's 7 bullets on the left side that they've identified as important for helping make groundwater more visible. Demystifying. It is below the ground. It's not a lake. We need better visualizations. I had one of my senior staff mention to me that Guelph's drinking water supply was like a large bathtub and you put a bunch of straws in it, whereas Waterloo's was smaller because we're on smaller isolated aquifers. What that example doesn't do is that our bathtub cumulatively is bigger than what Guelph's might be. And ours is spread out over a number of different ways, but the bathtub just doesn't work because it implies that it's all full of water, and we know that that's not the case because it's water moving through the pores and cracks and fractures that quantify the amount of water that's actually available. Unlocking the potential, so enhancing, looking for opportunities to build in redundancy into the overall watershed management, such as banks and buffers for dry spells. So being able to understand the contribution of recharge and base flow from groundwater is important to ensuring that we have surface water features under those extended droughts. The complexity, where is the water coming from? Where is it going? We've certainly had lots of presentations on that today, but making that relatable to people so that they understand that it's more complex, that it moves slower than surface water will go a long way in helping them put it into a perspective relative to surface water. The impacts of climate change, we are going to see impacts of that. We're still while we can model what we think it might happen, the reality is with the change being so locally and so random, it's going to be hard to match those modeling predictions. Data on hidden use. A lot of the agricultural sector doesn't actually have to go through the same permit to take water process that the municipalities and other water takers do. While they still have to get a permit, it's a different application process. So, where is all the water use out there when they don't all have to follow the same process? And how do we make sure that the years where some data was not collected is gathered so that we can make these long-term analysis of trends? Highlighting the role in biodiversity, again, importance of groundwater recharge, of providing base flow to surface water features, and the importance that does when we get into drought environments. And with increasing salt amounts in our urban areas, we can expect to see increasing chloride levels in our base flow of our creeks because of the long-term recharge of salt into the system. And while I know that many hydrogeologists don't like to join hands, and during the pandemic, that's certainly the case, but with engineers at least, I think the more we can educate the engineers in the other related fields that hydrogeology is important, the more likely it is that we'll have success in ensuring that groundwater and hydrogeology is an important part of our managing the resource moving forward. I did have these all flashed up to go on and off, like the Mission Impossible thing. If your mission is to to educate people, Steve, if you choose to accept it, And as always, this will dissolve or destruct in 5 seconds, but it doesn't work when you're not in charge of the slides. No offense, Rob. Thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Eric. Sorry that we messed up your self-destruction clause. Okay, our final panelist is Rick Gerber, and Rick, I'll just turn it over to you to take us through your insights.
Thanks, Steve. Rob, can you go to the next slide while I kind of introduce myself? So I'm a hydrogeologist, and I work for an entity called the Oak Ridges Moraine Groundwater Program, which is basically 5 municipalities, York, Peel, Durham, the City of Toronto, and Halton, and 10 conservation authorities that occur within the jurisdictions of those municipalities. So I guess our goal is to collect and interpret and apply water-related info to various issues that these people have. So I guess my experience, I actually came out of Waterloo with Eric, the elder, way back in 1985. Eric provided the perspective today, since you've been taking a bit of abuse, Eric. He's provided the perspective today from a successful hydrogeologist. I'm not sure if I can say that, so maybe that pumps you up a little bit, Eric. And then I did graduate work at U of T. I had a few years of consulting experience for large multidisciplinary consulting firms, Marshall Macklin and Dillon Consulting. Then I taught for a couple of years at University of Toronto out of the geology department, which was a very eye-opening experience. And then I did consulting on my own. And then in 2006, I joined the Oak Ridges Moraine Groundwater Program. So I hope I can kind of provide, to me, I've got a lot of thoughts running through my head, and hopefully I can funnel them into a coherent message. But there's some quotes in here. I just threw them up as miscellaneous points because I think it really sums up kind of what I think about on a daily basis, or what I think I've learned over my career. So 3 of them at the beginning came from the Geological Society of America presidential address from Mark Little last year, which I really liked. And the first one is, we understand the past creates everything that we see, and that what we observe now will shape the future. So scientists and hydrogeologists were historians. Can you guys hear me okay? I just kind of went, yeah? Okay, good. We're basically historians, so we understand how the Earth works naturally. We also are aware of how things can change through anthropogenic influences. The second one, so number 1, we're historians. The ingenuity, innovation, and creativity that is derived from not being able to escape the consequences of one's actions over the course of generations is profound. So to me, I'm into this, we are into this, the people I work with, we call it groundwater knowledge, but it's basically a collective experience, lessons learned, and I think we're kind of lacking in collecting that and applying that, or a lot of us are. Some cultures do a great job of it, others not so much. And then the last point that Mark talked about, the wondrousness of the Earth itself, or how the Earth works, and interest in how the Earth works. And to me, that's kind of why I got into science in the first place. And I still think that that's kind of what drives me, is that I always want to see what happens if we do this. How does this work? So I'm always kind of into that. And that's kind of what drives me. And then years ago, back in the 90s, another giant in the hydrogeo field who we recently lost, John Bredehoff, wrote an opinion piece, and he basically said, it is in our long-term best interest to have a well-informed public. So basically, it was looking at how much money had been spent on contaminated sites, and a lot of groundwater cannot be cleaned up. Maybe things have changed a little bit now. Perhaps they have. And if the public found out how much we spent, and our bottom line is much groundwater cannot be cleaned up, we'll never reach people. And then the last one is something that I kind of threw in there because it's almost like what I've kind of learned is assume that everything gets noticed. So when I've dealt with young people in the past who were starting in their careers, the complaint would be, I'm working really hard, no one notices what I'm doing. And I've always thought or found that your rewards may have a significant delay to them. So just assume that everything you do gets noticed, because it probably is. And even failures or mistakes, how you come out of those gets noticed. So for me, when I've been in situations, usually the feedback I get immediately is, Rick, you're wrong. Rick, I don't know if I can use the word idiot, but I've been called that. Rick, you're naive. That's immediate. But then sometimes fast forward a few years and maybe you're not so naive because what you suggested is actually being picked up on. So I guess that's something that I always try and keep in the back of my head. Positive feedback may be delayed. Engagement from the public or engineers or planners may be delayed. But as I think it was Simon mentioned, the ramifications of change that we invoke on the landscape may be delayed by years or decades. So these are kind of like miscellaneous points that I swirl around in my head all the time. So next, please, Rob. So to kind of just to sort of sum up where things have gone in my career. So one of the things that struck me back in the 80s and 90s when I was working for consulting companies is a lot of time was spent on driving around to collect information, air photos. You had to go in person and get well records. That took up a lot of time, but it was the first thing that happened on a job, or many jobs, at least with the folks I was working with. Starting around, the late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of the information became digitally available, or it was a lot easier to get at. And then it was kind of like, oh, we've got a lot of information. Do I have the time to look at it? So we're starting to be overwhelmed a little bit with information. That's germane to our various problems that we're working on. So we kind of thought, well, let's try and make a one-stop shopping for a lot of information from different places, interpret it, and make that available. And then one of the things that we've noticed is that there's not a lot of use. There's not a lot of uptake. Basically, you can't just hand people a pile and say, you figure it out, which is kind of what we were hoping for, but it doesn't work out that way. So we've started on a couple things that are aimed at what does that mountain of information mean, and how can I message a short, sweet message to various people about what it all means and why should I, as a hydrogeologist, be at the table. So one of the things that we've been working on was a lot of people come to us when they have problems. They have big groundwater problems, and they have to control groundwater forever. Okay, so perhaps one of the things that we can work on for our short, simple messaging is where would I go to look for groundwater trouble? Okay, and the next key thing is to put this into like a cost context, and it doesn't have to be absolute. It can be relative costs. If you go here, chances are your subsurface costs and your long-term maintenance costs may be much higher because you need to control subsurface conditions forever. And then another thing that we have tried to work on is this we see a repetition in mistakes. So people look for wells now where they looked 30 years ago. People run into the same kind of issues with subsurface conditions that are leading to a huge cost, and they're surprised. So we're trying to make products, a simple picture, a couple pages of text or whatever, to try and that's one of our ways of trying to boil things down and get a message out there. So just some miscellaneous points below the line is some of the things, not necessarily that bug me, but I ponder a lot, or I've seen, is there's a cyclical interest in science, okay, by planners, politicians, students, enrollments in universities. There seems to be a lot of interest and associated cost, perhaps, when a crisis happens. And this cyclical nature, it's almost like we have interest, then we lose interest, and we're always kind of starting and restarting. So we can never generate momentum that we need, which goes beyond decades. We seem to be a cyclical stop and start kind of climate, I guess. Another thing is fragmentation of policies under many different agencies. That may lead to a little bit of confusion, but that's just something I see. I've seen a lot of, so when the cycle is high and there's interest in us and there's money, we often, or we have in the past, seen duplication of efforts. That was that third point there. And then repetition, we run into the same problems repeatedly, separated perhaps by decades. So there's that lack of collective experience, lessons learned. And then a lot of my early career, when I'm working more site specific, was you're always thinking, how does this fit into the big picture, what I'm doing on this postage stamp? I wonder what the people found at the postage stamp next to my postage stamp. I wonder what they found when they drilled. Excuse me. What are the cumulative impacts of all of these postage stamps? So to me, there was sort of a lack, I guess, of integration. And I'm not just talking about groundwater. I'm talking about all sciences and all, I called it societal values here, but it's just, I mean, do we want houses and 7-Elevens everywhere? Do we want recreation areas? That's societal. I mean, a lot of what we do isn't dictated directly by science, but there's a lot of different disciplines and values that need to be brought into some of these decisions. And I don't think we necessarily do a good job of that. Next, please, Rob. So I've kind of gone through some of the problems, and let on the last slide, and let's just say that we have a lack of integration, and let's pretend that we're not messaging as well as we could, because we are historians. I think we have a lot to offer. We know how things, or we have a lot of history that can be applied to future endeavors. So a couple of the ways that we're trying to deal with integrating and messaging is to take all this information and make a message. And obviously it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to, I go into grade 4 classrooms, sometimes my message is a little bit different and my materials are a little bit different than when I'm at university or when I'm talking to commissioners at the regional municipalities. But so we've started to work on trying to collect groundwater stories that talk about, lessons learned. They have to control groundwater here forever. That should, to any hydrogeologist or anyone in an area, especially a hydrogeologist, say, oh, this is happening. That's going to cost a lot to deal with that. And then also mapping, and I'll show a quick example of where would I go to look for groundwater trouble, and we call that areas of concern mapping. So what does the future hold? I threw in diversity and inclusion, and I'm not going to get into it, but I mean, obviously we have a lot of work to do on that topic or actions related to that. I think for me, I kind of focus on, I need to understand the complexity of everything that we know, and then I need to see how simple I can make the world when I try and explain it to people. So to me, that's like lessons learned, collective knowledge that I'm focused on. And then that John Bredehoff quote, the well-informed public, and I put in brackets certainty, uncertainty, because I spoke with a friend of mine, Joanne Thompson, the other day about this topic. We talked for quite a while, and the word uncertainty came up a lot. So, for instance, people have a hard time or have a problem with scientists when they display uncertainty. Climate change is a great example. Well, not a great example, but an example of the messaging. Uncertainty seems to take away some of the message. It can if you're not careful on how you explain things. And then we've seen issues where talks at a conference get interrupted by people screaming and shouting because they're concerned that people aren't listening. So how do we get our message across? Do we scream and shout? Do we work within, which is slow, or both? I mean, I think it's a question of, I think we need both. We need people screaming and shouting. We need people trying to work from within. We need to do anything we can to get our message across. And a lot of people complain about enrollments being low at universities, whether they are or not. Maybe that's cyclical too. Where and what age should we inform the public? I think it starts at any age. But I found I think a sweet spot for me. Like, I've just gone into classrooms as my daughter and friends' kids grew up. And now I go back to Pleasantville Public School in Richmond Hill periodically, where I grew up. And the sweet spot is a grade 4 class. You go into a grade 4 class with a box of rocks and fossils and a map of the world and see where they take you. And you're into, why are we drinking out of a lake? And our toilets flush into the lake. Why don't we put garbage on the moon? I mean, it's fantastic, but maybe none of them will become scientists, but maybe they'll have appreciation of what's involved and with how the Earth works. So next slide, please. So having previously stated that I look at my kind of role or my goal of taking complexity and seeing how far I can simplify that. And I also have to do that so that perhaps I have a chance of understanding it. So in order to organize in my head information, I need a system. So I think we have a system. I'm lucky enough to be around a database, interpretive products, interpretive tools that are constantly being refined. Next slide, Rob, please. And then simple figures. This one may be not simple enough, and it depends on who I'm talking to, but where would I go? This is part of that areas of concern mapping. Where would I go to find groundwater troubles that, by extension, would have an elevated cost associated with them? And chances are, like if I'm talking to a commissioner of planning or whatever, I might try and relate that to a landform. Hey, you know what? You have a big hill in the middle of your jurisdiction, and that big hill is where a lot of your groundwater problems are. So, I mean, that's pretty simple. But if I can take all the complexity and it comes out down to that, then let's just make a map of that can be refined as more information comes in. So basically, as all of this information does come in, I need to filter it as it comes in. So I'm, in a way, saying if I have one figure on a deserted island, can that one figure help me explain everything that I'm looking at? Next slide, please. And this is an example of our water stories. We call it groundwater knowledge, but it's, here was an underpass that they've had flowing conditions for. You can't keep the road in repair, and it's been going on, in this case, since the early 2000s. And it's a paragraph or two, and it's a location on a map. And this is tough to compile because people don't like to talk about bad things. They don't like to talk about trouble. There's no journal of failed experiments, but this is our attempt from people we talk to, and if it's okay with them, we throw a short story up and give it a location so that anyone coming in to do work here may want to be aware of this because it probably has a cost implication to anything subsurface. So next slide, please, Rob. So I didn't know how negative today was going to go, or whether whether what we do is positive or negative, but there's a lot of really good stuff going on. But this to me speaks to it's not necessarily integrated yet, and it's not necessarily all messaged yet, but there's a lot of great stuff going on. And Simon mentioned we're too collegial. I don't know. I've been involved in a group that's has an ongoing dialogue. So I guess the start is you get a bunch of different players, and I'm lucky in that for the last 20 years I've had, or more, throughout my career, I've had an ongoing dialogue with not only the people I work with and all the partners now, but people at the Geologic Survey of Canada, people at the Ontario Geologic Survey, people at the province, and it's an ongoing dialogue about what are we doing, and it's just, I mean, that's the only way we can overcome some of this, because it's not just one person, it's everyone. So I like the continual dialogue. I mean, I saw a lot of anger in the 80s and 90s, and it was more whenever you went into a room with a bunch of hydrogeologists, there was a joke that came out in the late 80s, I think, related to a landfill hearing, and it stuck with me. It was called, I called it the lesson of what fools we make of ourselves. So the joke was that 10 hydrogeologists went on the stand and there was 11 flow systems that they had to deal with. And the board got to the point where they disregarded the evidence of experts on certain issues. I'm trying to remember the details, but and that's stuck with me forever. Another positive thing we're doing is some people have said that for land use, we've got the Niagara Escarpment Plan, the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan, the Green Belt. Good or bad, I guess someone decided that we just didn't want sprawl everywhere. We wanted to break it up, give people areas where they could go for a walk that wasn't just up and down a street covered in houses and 7-Elevens. There's a really good work that's been going on for a long time, 3D geologic mapping. It's amazing what you can do when you have a good three-dimensional structure to work with. The OGS is doing this. The Geologic Survey of Canada do this. We do this, Oak Ridges Moraine Groundwater Program, and a lot of ours incorporates mapping that's been done by our friends in the consulting community for numerical models or various projects. There's a lot of good water quality stuff going on. So the Source Water Protection Program, they're mapping potential contaminant sources. There's some people at universities and the province who are looking at chlorides in groundwater and various water reservoirs. The MECP, sorry, I call them the MOE, MECP are actually now starting to track and make available actual takings related to permits. And then one of the keys is that monitoring, and it's not just because we have to for compliance purposes. So we've got a provincial groundwater monitoring network, and we had one in the 70s, but there's that cyclical thing again, right? Interest, no interest. Money for monitoring, no money for monitoring. But we do have a lot of good pieces now. And I guess one of the keys is that we probably need a lot of patience, but do we have time for patience? So next slide, please, Rob. So I stole this slide from Steve Holysh, who put it together. So we haven't collected it, but we've collated, I guess, a lot of the hydrogeologic community collects a lot of information. We put in water wells. We write reports. We collect groundwater levels. We take samples. We make models. And this is Steve's attempt at, this is infrastructure. Like, how much is it worth? Like, this is the complexity. This is the story. So now we have to take all this. In an ideal world, let's take all this and learn from it and pass that on in a simple, as simple as possible way. All right. So, again, our goal, or my goal, it is our long-term best interest to have a well-informed public. So I think I will leave it with that. I think there's one more slide, but now here's one sentence, Steve. I'm just about done. I don't know if I'm over time or not, but when I go into a fourth-year class, I go sometimes to U of T, and they have a seminar class where they bring in people. The students give they give talks on various topics, but they also bring in professionals to talk about what they do. And then we talk about their careers and if they can expect to be given a car in their first job and things like that. And then what would I say to them? And I think I would, and I often say, and I don't know if it means, I think it does mean something, but I always say, assume everything gets noticed. Try to make it positive. So I think with that, I will end, and thank you everyone for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. Okay, I you know what, I really want to just thank all four of you guys for taking a lot of time and giving a lot of thought to the discussion. So, you know, really much appreciated, because I didn't know where this would go. So we still have a few minutes for questions. So what I want to do, I'm gonna just throw a question out there for you guys to start. And so one of the things that you know, I think all of you touched on a little bit, and it's you know, this idea of stories and trying to get people excited about what we're doing. And so we've talked about this in our discussions, and I think I'll throw it out at you guys just for real. But it's, you know, trying to think of stories that inspired you during your careers, and it could be, you know, just digging into the science or communication or just things that kind of inspired you. And one of the things that I mentioned when we talked about this was, I mean, there's two things that go through my head when I thought about this question. One is, you know, standing beside Andy Bites and looking at his cored boreholes of all these rhythmites and just thinking about the thousands and thousands of years of deposition and kind of really being excited and realizing that I was a real beneficiary of that kind of information. And then a second thing was on this wetland that I was working on and really measuring discharge from the wetland to a river and noticing in the discharge that if you went early in the morning at 6, 7, the discharge was gushing out of this wetland to the river. And as the sun came up and the day went on, the discharge essentially became zero. And as the sun set, it gushed again. And it was like seeing the earth breathe and just so that was really cool. And then what we've tried to do in our program is put all this data together so that people can maybe chew in the data and discover stuff that gets them excited. And that's really driven us and me to put all this data together in our program. And so I was thinking that you know, I think there's a responsibility on us as earth scientists, hydrogeologists, to try and take some of that passion that we all have experienced. I think we've experienced it, and tell stories. And it gets back to the, you know, what Rick said about stories and historians. And you know, we're in an unusual position that we understand the planet more than most folks. And I think there's a responsibility to convey that. And I thought maybe I'd just throw that out as a starter to each of you to maybe throw you know, an idea or a question or a thought or a story that inspired you as you went through your career. I don't know, maybe start with you, Simon.
Yeah, I got one. I know what you mean. Like, for a long time we study hydrogeology, and it's in the classroom, and Eric said it's very theoretical. we look at the equations and stuff like that, and then you go out to the field and you do your little thing, but you don't get to see the big picture. I remember I worked on the Victor Diamond Mine project up in James Bay, and it was a huge water taking. The mine shut down now; everything's almost at closure. But we'd spent a couple of years doing the groundwater studies, running a big 30-day pumping test, a bunch of other things, and then we did all the math, threw it in the models, and then ran the predictions. And then I was lucky enough to stay on the project for the entire frame of the project and watch how those predictions panned out. And about 5 years into the project, when everything had more or less stabilized, and it's a good news story for me because it all worked out more or less the way it's meant to work out. But it wasn't until then, like it took that long to observe the math in motion, to see all that thing work, make a prediction and watch it come true. And I think that's something we miss in the university setting. You do get it a bit in your master's because you'll do a thesis or something like that. But going from the classroom textbook knowledge to seeing it happen, making a prediction, and then watching it work. That was.
Would you have felt the same if your prediction was wrong?
Well, I wouldn't have known why it was wrong. Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, yeah. Like,
no, thanks for that.
Yeah,
I'm not putting you on the spot. Thanks. How about you, Eric the Young?
Yeah. So, like I said in my presentation, early in my career, right? So things about my career that have really like inspired me. It's tough because I'm still really in like a learning process right now. So I think a couple of things that I can touch on, maybe like what gets me out of bed in the morning or what inspires me to do this. I'm a pretty avid outdoorsman, so I like to be outside. I like to fish. I like to be out there, on the water doing stuff. And for me, one of the big reasons that I wanted to get into hydrogeology and geology in general was one, to not only understand those environments better, but also selfishly, if the watersheds aren't healthy, if the groundwater is not healthy, then the ecosystem isn't healthy. And if the ecosystem isn't healthy, then I have nothing to go do. I can't be out on the water fishing if the fish can't live in those environments. So that's what kind of inspires me. And then also maybe something that I thought was interesting when I first started was kind of tagging on to what you were saying there, Simon, where you come out of the classroom and you've looked at PowerPoint slides and chalkboards, and that's great. You might have had a little bit of experience touching some dirt here or there, some cores in a lab, but once you actually get out there and you get onto a drilling site and you start pulling up cores and you're logging it and you're trying to interpret it and tell a story, that was something that I thought was so cool. And just transitioning from that classroom mindset into the actual real world mindset was really fascinating for me.
Great, thanks for that. How about you, Eric, the old
elder?
Sorry, Matt.
Steve, come on, elder. Well, I've
the
got
wise. That's what I think. Sure,
I've got a couple that sort of are the opposite from what Simon had commented. That he did a whole bunch of testing and then it was so exciting to see the outcome. Well, in one of our well fields, we had a detection in Kitchener, we had a detection of chromium, kind of came out of the blue. You could see it starting to arrive as we were monitoring water quality. And we had to make some decisions after we shut it off because we couldn't pump it because we didn't know what was going to happen. We have 3 wells operating, and we decided to develop a strategy to pump one to waste where we were getting the chromium and put the other 2 back into supply. And I don't think I would have been in a position to be able to make that recommendation to have wells that were almost beside each other, be drinking from the one or the 2 and pumping the other one to the waste for a long period of time. So that was really interesting. And that was about the 3 months that I was losing sleep over, because we had to make a decision. We couldn't not have the wells operating for a long period of time because we need the water. And so we did eventually do that approach, and then we all crossed our fingers as we turned the wells on, and we had a really nice monitoring program and a really kept it on a schedule, and lo and behold, it worked exactly the way we had projected. So it was a tremendous sense of accomplishment built on 20 years worth of data collection and understanding the aquifer system to have the confidence to be able to to turn that well system back on, and we still have that contamination, and we still don't even know where it's coming from yet.
Another good news story. Good. No, that's awesome. How about you, Rick? Anything that grabs you?
I think what kind of drives me is I got really lucky early in my career where my first job was I got to do everything. So I got to make a proposal, I got to meet with the client, I got to do the field work, I got to write the report, and then I had to go, and my boss said, this is the most important part. You have to go explain it to them in person. So I kind of learned, and then you realize that I think once you start getting, hopefully you get positive feedback, and the confidence that you get from that. And then that got morphed into, I was also lucky to be on a couple of really big projects. Like one was a lead soil contamination cleanup, and another was siting landfills. And you're going in there, there's a lot of anger, and you have to deal with the public, and you have to explain it, and you have to learn on the spot, because you're like 5 years into your career. And someone said, let's send Rick in. And I got pretty lucky, because you learn quick how to, next thing you know, farmers are inviting you in for coffee, and it's just too bad, Rick, that a landfill has to go here. But I really appreciate that you're explaining what you're thinking about and what's going on. So I think that a lot of that, it wasn't any one thing. It was more a bunch of little things. And I mentioned that one about the landfill and our perception in a hearing, where there's 10 hydrogeologists and 11 flow systems. I kind of vowed then, like, I don't want to ever be a part of that. Like, how can I get away from that? So for me, it's a bunch of little things. And then also, when you see, I also like watching when younger people start to develop that confidence to kind of speak out. That's a really positive thing for me. I love seeing that. And I also love it when a client, I remember a commissioner of planning, we were in a meeting and it was very angry with a bunch of developers and a bunch of their scientists and agency scientists. And one of the hydrogeologists for a developer was given a talk, and the commissioner of planning stood up and tore him wide open. And the developer sitting next to me said, wow, who's been teaching her? And I thought, man, I guess someone is listening, So it's a lot of little things, but I think it's all about confidence, right? So
I think a lot of those, Rick, boil down to communication, and you're a great communicator, and you can get your ideas across. And I think, I think that's what, what you just said, that's what I boil it down to.
Yeah, but that doesn't come easy. I mean, I lie awake at night, as we all do, like boiling about how can I deal with this? How can I reach people?
I just all of those nuggets I could boil down to communication, and I know you as a good communicator. So hats off. And you echoed a lot of Simon's comments about inspiring people. Put yourself out there, right? Put yourself in difficult positions like you were put in, and then you learn through the school of hard knocks. Okay, there's a few questions up on, from we do have a few extra minutes, so we're being granted, because you guys are so good in your panel comments, that they've graced us with an extra 10 minutes. So we'll go through some of these questions, see how far we get before 3 o'clock. First one, broader community is looking for greater, more meaningful role in groundwater allocation and management. How do you see us meeting the need? That's for anyone. Anyone have any thoughts on that? You want to just unmute and go for it? Okay, we'll go to the next question.
I'll say this. I mean, what happens is we talk amongst ourselves and hydrogeologists, and then it's like that pyramid picture that Rick showed. You go to the next level, and it's a bunch of non-hydrogeologists, and your one voice You're sitting there, and it could be a bunch of scientists, fish scientists, terrestrial scientists, and stuff like that. But then there's planners, there's engineers, there's all these people bringing all these issues together. Somebody's got to make the decision, and we're just one voice in a crowd of voices. Back to articulate what Rick's saying, you have to learn how to communicate effectively, and you need to be trustworthy. You've got to make it work. I think that's where it comes down to. It's going to be, in the end, it's decisions not usually made on just groundwater alone. Like, take that places to live thing. People need places to live. The population's growing. People need houses. Groundwater plays a part in that. How much a role it plays in that has a lot to do with the personalities involved presenting the groundwater information.
Yeah, good point. Rick, you were going to say something?
Yeah, and the broader community, this isn't just now to the working with the people that allocate and manage. It's also, Beatrice was talking about those school children and the water fairs. We have no idea who is going to be what. People change careers. People, maybe they're not a scientist, but maybe they're a planner. I mean, it's an investment, and that's why the cyclicity of things drives me crazy, because we need to just keep building on inroads with our messaging, and it's trying to reach everybody, I think, is the key. But, for instance, Hugh asked before about the ag community and in the agricultural community. Like, I'm not even in the room with a lot of people that we could be. It just takes time.
Yeah, I mean, there could also be a role in some of these citizen scientist groups that, even collecting information and I mean, I think in our program too, with getting all that information and OGS onto maps and websites and so letting people see the data as much as they can, we can simplify it for them so they can get a picture of long-term water levels or water table maps or depth to water table, some of those things maybe. Okay, I don't know. How about moving to the second question, specifically for you, Rick, ideas on uncertainty to non-scientists without losing trust?
Yeah, and I think, so talking with Joanne Thompson about uncertainty. So a lot of engineers, in my experience, are very receptive to dealing with me. Some may not be. And it's all about, you have to read the situation. Like, how angry are people? How contentious is it? So I'm going to start with an answer. And as Simon said, I may be not sleeping for a number of nights because I gave an answer, because I want to give an answer and I want to be in the game. But my answer always, I want to qualify that. Like, I'm taking the maximum groundwater level from 30 years of monitoring, or I'm taking the maximum groundwater level from 2 years of monitoring. I have less confidence in the latter, but it's almost like, okay, I'm going to give an answer and I want to make a sentence or two of qualifying now because the anger level's really high right now. So you try and give someone something to think about and then maybe hit them again with another, here's what I'm thinking about when I give you that answer, and seeing what the response is. So sometimes you have to feed slow, and it's all like, that's the problem. There's no prescription here. It's just, and that's why I like in-person stuff a lot. Now I know I'm missing the boat, as you said, Eric, Chevrier, on social media, etc. I really am, but I have people around me who I think can cover that. But to me, it's all about what is the feedback I'm getting when I start to qualify something. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, Steve, but that's kind of how I approach it.
Anyone
depending
else
on the level of anger that I'm dealing with.
Or
maybe I'm not dealing with anger. So,
you like to tilt your head like a puppy dog, you say. I mean, that works too, right?
Sometimes people believe you if they think you're being cute. I'm
Anyone
not cute
else
anymore though, because I'm Rick the Elder, right?
Yeah, and cute usually isn't in my nomenclature when I come to describe you.
Thank you.
I think what we face this issue fairly regularly because the wellhead protection areas that we delineate for our drinking water supply wells are based on the knowledge we have. They're going into an official plan, which has some level of constraints, what you can do in it and what you can do outside of it, or not, or what you not, the broader, you don't have to, you're not constrained outside of it. And the biggest fear from the policymakers and the politicians is what happens when those areas change. We know they're going to change. They'll always change because your data level is going to improve as you get there. So what you have to, so what we tried to do is build that uncertainty into our wellhead protection areas to minimize the chance that they're going to change too much in the future. So it's all a modeling exercise, and this is something you can do in a modeling exercise. Is you can create some different conditions, produce a new calibrated model, and run some scenarios based on that, or run a couple of scenarios. So that gives you some sense of robustness. And you could also look at the approach where you could take sort of the minimum overlap area, or maybe you take the maximum outside area of those wellhead protection areas, however they're delineated. And some of that decision depends on what you're trying to do with that protection area. Are you trying to make it small so that it's less impacted on the community? Are you trying to make it large so you get a better buffer? Because in theory, land use practices, if you can manage them in some manner better than what they've been managed in the past, then perhaps you have a chance for a longer term supply. So, one of the ways to handle it, and as Rick commented, he uses the the preamble, or he wants to add that extra bit of sentences in there. If you can maybe build that right into your process, then maybe you don't have to, and you have to hope that it'll withstand that scrutiny, or it will stand improvement in data over time.
Yeah, good. How about we maybe jump to the next one on ecosystem services? So I don't know, anyone want to jump at that one?
You're always talking about that, Steve Holysh. We don't value water.
Yeah, but I'm not on the panel, man. So you have to deal with it.
You're our leader.
Yeah, I could jump in. I'll start off.
Sure, go for it,
I mentioned it a little bit earlier. Water is just one part of what society values. It has to compete with all the other things that the society wants. It'll always be, the ecosystem services. If nobody's fishing, people aren't going to value fish. That'll always be a moving target. If we think that we can say groundwater is the trump card in a political decision making, we're not being realistic.
But I think John Cherry talked a little bit about that in his talk as well. If there's too much water pumped, and we all know that, groundwater is the big integrator, right, of everything. We understand that, but no one else does. And if we over-exploit the resource, that we're not really doing in Ontario, so we're, more like Simon says, we're in a low consequence environment. But if you're in a higher consequence environment, like John Cherry talks about Iran and Saudi Arabia and India, and having no water, and realizing that, holy son of a gun, the groundwater feeds the rivers, and there's no water in the rivers anymore because our groundwater is down 50, 80 meters. I mean, so I think, I think I would say we're not valuing it, and we're not, and I think part of it is communication. We're not passionate enough, and not, it's interesting because I told my chiropractor what I was doing, and he a month later said, "Oh, I saw a story about a water issue in California, and I was thinking about you." And so the very fact that I kind of spoke to him a little bit emotionally about it, I was excited about what I was doing and what my career was, and he picked up on that enough that he made a comment. And so I think just every one of us has that responsibility, the responsibility to communicate as well as you can do to anyone and everyone as you go through your life. So anyway, that's my thought on that one.
I actually could tag along with that, Steve, a little bit there. I agree completely with what you're saying, and from a from a marketing perspective, I think that's probably one of our easiest selling points, to try to communicate the importance of what we're doing to the general public is hey, yeah, like you might not see groundwater, but a lot of the surface water people enjoy, the wetlands, rivers, creeks, all that kind of stuff is all dependent on groundwater. So again, from a marketing standpoint, I think that's our easiest way into the general public is to say, hey, if we don't start paying attention to what's going on here, these nice surface water features that we all see they might not be what they used to be. But yeah, that's just my kind of general thoughts on it.
Yeah, thanks. How about, okay, so it's 3:00. I mean, maybe we'll do jump down 2 because the next one is sort of surface water, groundwater. How about the waterborne disease one? Anyone have a thought on that?
Well, that's Walkerton, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, that's a tactic. There is some, suggesting scaring the public with a worst case scenario. It is really scary when it happens. So.
Yeah.
Well, and the if I can jump in on that, the challenge, that I would have in looking at that is, well, I operate some of those drinking water supply systems. So if I start to be critical of that process or have comments on it, then they look inward and they say, well, what are you doing, right or wrong? And so it's a tough one to sell when you're the actual agent that's taking the water, and that's links back to the groundwater surface water interaction as well. A lot of what we do as water takers for municipality has negative implications to surface water bodies. It does change the flow system. It does change how water moves. So a water supplier is in a really tough position to try to want to make those links without undermining the trust that the community has in the service that they're providing. So it's a very slippery slope. When you're starting to link diseases to water management.
And there's 2 easy solutions. You're just telling people to go buy bottled water, or you're building water treatment plants at the water distribution center. So. Yeah.
Or you send Rick to to.
Yeah, I mean, apparently Rick, a room full of angry people. Let's just get Rick. I mean, that's it. Send him in. Lock the doors.
Yeah, but maybe I made them angry in the first place.
Oh, well.
But I guess this linking waterborne diseases, I mean, we had a crisis and we've had some interest and we've had some money spent, and now we can't lose that momentum. We got to build on it so that it never happens again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we got a couple, go to 3:05, even 3:10. Holy smokes. People are loving you guys. You're the stars of the show. How about the diversity one? Anyone? Eric, maybe Eric the Young. Eric I'll leave it at young. I was going to go for an antonym of wise, but I won't do that.
Yeah. How can we bring people into this highly technical field? I think that's a great question. And I can kind of speak to this. I mean, I was halfway through a business degree before I even realized that geology was a career path, or not only a viable career path, but one with opportunity. And I think I can maybe just relate to what I touched on in my presentation there, where the younger generations are, they've been paying attention. Simon, you mentioned, we need to scare the public. I'd say my generation's getting scared. Where they've been paying attention, they've been listening, they understand that, we got to change the way we operate here and the way we think about our resources. And I think that's probably the best way to do it is that we just need to get loud and we need to get active and let people know that, hey, geology is a good career. It's a career where you can make an impact and there's going to be opportunity moving forward.
I would maybe there's diversity within science. You could see it changing, especially if you live in an urban center. There's also a lot of diversity out there in the non-scientist field. Work up, a lot of what I hear these days with dealing in public engagement is spiritual values. And that's a completely non-science view of looking at something. And these people have strong beliefs about it. And they're not, you have to respect their belief. That's what they believe. But it makes it very difficult to come in with a scientific argument.
Yeah, but I think sharing passionate stories from a science perspective would
Correct.
resonate with those people as well, right? I mean,
It does. It does. They look
Yeah.
at the person more than they look at the numbers,
yeah.
which is often what people do.
How about Eric the Young again down at the bottom there? Any thoughts on how should university teaching change to provide most relevant training? Yeah, but any thoughts on that as you ruminated on your presentation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's tough.
Besides
right?
using our MGP website, for which I give you full thumbs up, and I didn't pay you to do that either. And Don
Again?
Ford said he didn't pay you to say that either, so it's a bonus.
Well, I'm still open to payment if that's an option.
I didn't get paid either, so.
I would suggest
okay.
it because I that stuff was never available when I was in school. You guys need to do a certificate program. If I was as an employer looking for people, I have a lot of influence on who comes into the organization. If there was some sort of like certificate or something like that saying you'd taken the course, you understood how these databases worked, that would actually be something that you could do, and give it to a younger person. That would make them stick out. Once you start working, you have very little time for this stuff.
I would add that I think Beatrice from the Children's Groundwater Festival brought in a very unique perspective when asking kids from Ontario versus kids from Mexico about what their conservation or experiences are with water. And I certainly don't remember a lot in the university area about the world experience with groundwater. I mean, yes, there's a few, slides or a few notes that say, groundwater is used in certain percentage of the country, but in the world. There's nothing really that drills down into it to look at the issues that, California and in the significant droughts. The fact that states are considering change, have floated the idea of changing their state borders because their ground watersheds no longer align with their surface watersheds. We don't know what the impact of war is, and on all of the environmental constraints or impacts that war has had on say infrastructure in Ukraine, and what long-lasting impacts that might have on groundwater. So I think there could be there's certainly a lot more examples out there now of perhaps one could say how it's not being properly managed, and that might spur a number of people to get into the field to try to change that trend and try to get into the more positive side of helping manage.
Okay, thanks for that. So, you know what? It's 3:08. Should I wrap it up, Kyla? Or there's one at the bottom that might.
So, I was gonna say, Steve, could we maybe touch on that, because I think it's important.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go for that one, and then we'll wrap it up, because that one was interesting. Yeah.
So maybe I'll touch on this one first. Any advice for younger hydrogeologists on how to gain more confidence in their work? So obviously I am a young hydrogeologist, so I can maybe apply this to myself as well. But just get yourself out there and talk to people, right? Like there's so much knowledge out there, and there's so many smart people already working in this industry. Get in there, go ask them questions, just be involved, and through just being involved, being in the same room with these people, you can see how they operate and how they communicate and what they do with the knowledge that they have, and you can then translate that into your own career. But I think Rick touched on it as well, where it's like, don't be afraid to make a mistake or pipe up or something. If you're wrong, right? Like, who cares? You move on. Nobody's going to die or anything. You can still, go home and see your family and then move on, right? And especially if you're going to make mistakes in your career, it might as well be while you're young and in your career, because that's when people are expecting you to make mistakes. So that would be my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah,
and
also.
Eric, Rick.
I would just say that you just have to take a leap of faith to some degree. You have to try. I recall in my dim days before I was in a hydrogeologist at the region of Waterloo and consulting, where I did a general groundwater monitoring program for an oil application project. And at the end of it, I was just there. I mean, the project just had a monitoring component and I was writing the report, but I decided to add some recommendations on expanding the monitoring, and that got their attention, and it really gave me some confidence moving forward.
Rick?
And in an ideal world, you're working with people, senior people at your firm, say, who give you the freedom to make mistakes because they're not going to be critical, because if a mistake is made, it will get caught, hopefully, before it goes out. And all we're doing is seeing how you think and giving you more responsibility. But the blame at a young age should be me. It shouldn't be the young person if any mistakes go out there. So you just have to kind of try to remove the fear of making them, because everyone's going to make them.
Yeah.
And if you can do that internally, fine. That's even better. It's a learning episode, right?
Simon, would you fire them, or will you have any other?
No, you do it. Make sure you want the mistake is somebody catching it internally and giving you shit for it, basically. That's a level of mistake that's survivable. Apparently you shouldn't tweet your mistakes. But then there's also, I always think about this, there was a point in my career where you're pretty confident, you think you know lots of stuff, and then you realize, so do something and you realize how little you know. And that's pretty educational too. So.
Hey, okay,
Also,
I think
maybe one more thing too is just for the younger crowd. I'm sure we've all experienced this, right? But it's with the hydrogeology subject matter. There's not a lot of people that'll really pay attention, or maybe not pay attention is the wrong word, but at least people that we can communicate with on a high level for some of these things. And most of the senior people that I've talked to are, just get out there and ask them questions. They're excited to talk to you about what they're doing, because again, like it's as hydrogeologists, we can only really communicate to each other at a high level about what we're doing. So most people are very excited to communicate to you about their work, and they get excited. I mean, I like talking about what I do. I'm sure the other panel members do as well, right? So if there's an opportunity to maybe create a dialogue, it's great, right? Just, and like we said, I think we've all touched on the same point. Just, you got to put yourself out there, right?
You all forgot that there's no mistakes in hydrogeology. It's all uncertainty, man. I mean, that's the beauty of our science, right? Okay, you know what? We forgot to talk about building homes faster, son of a gun, and that was in the title, but we'll leave that for next time. So, hey guys, thanks so much for all your insight. Really appreciate it, and really thoughtful discussion. And I think it was a hit. So thanks for your time and efforts. Really appreciate it.